Ethan Cross raised the pistol to his temple, finger trembling on the trigger, when the 800-pound grizzly bear sitting 20 feet away began to cry. The sound wasn't a roar or growl, it was the heartbroken whimper of a child who'd lost everything. This wasn't how he'd imagined dying would go. The bear rose on massive hind legs, tears streaming down its scarred muzzle, and took a careful step forward. Margaret O'Connor's kitchen light flickered on across the scrapyard, her silhouette freezing in the window as she witnessed the impossible scene unfolding in the Oregon moonlight. Ethan's hand shook harder as memories crashed through his whiskey-soaked mind. Ryan's last words in that Afghan desert, his father's funeral 3 weeks ago, the lawyer's bizarre inheritance conditions. The bear had been watching him drink for hours, as if it understood his pain. "Get back!" Ethan screamed, but his voice cracked with desperation rather than authority. The grizzly named Kodiak stepped closer, extending one massive paw toward the gun. What kind of creature mourns a stranger's death before it happens? And why did those dark eyes seem so heartbreakingly human? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 weeks earlier, Ethan Cross had been sleeping off another whiskey bender in his Portland studio apartment when the phone call shattered what little peace he'd managed to find. The voice belonged to Harrison Webb, the family attorney, a man whose existence Ethan had forgotten until that moment. "Your father passed peacefully in his sleep," Webb had said with the emotional range of a tax document. Colonel Samuel Cross, decorated veteran, survived by 3 children. The funeral is Thursday. Reading of the will is Friday at 10 sharp. Ethan had stared at his reflection in the black television screen, seeing a 34-year-old man who looked 50. His face carried the weathered topography of someone who'd seen too much, deep lines around his eyes from squinting through Afghan dust storms, a scar along his jaw from shrapnel, brown hair going prematurely gray at the temples. His tall, lean frame, once honed by Army Ranger discipline, now hung loose beneath a wrinkled flannel shirt that smelled of yesterday's bourbon. The funeral had been a study in contrasts. His siblings, Caleb and Isabel, had arrived looking like they'd stepped from the pages of Fortune magazine. Caleb, 2 years older, wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly disability check. His perfectly styled hair and cold, calculating eyes spoke of boardroom battles and hostile takeovers. He was Silicon Valley royalty now, his tech company worth hundreds of millions. Isabel had been equally impressive in her cream silk dress and designer heels, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon. As an international art dealer, she moved in circles where million-dollar paintings changed hands over champagne and small talk. She'd looked at Ethan with the same expression she might reserve for a damaged piece that couldn't be restored. Neither sibling had spoken to him beyond perfunctory condolences. The will reading had been even more surreal. To Caleb went the family trust fund, $25 million. Isabel received the Portland penthouse and another $20 million. Ethan had expected nothing and wanted less. "To my youngest son, Ethan," Webb had read in his monotone voice, "I leave Cascade Salvage, 40 acres in rural Oregon, including all buildings, equipment, and livestock. May he find the purpose there that has eluded him elsewhere." Caleb had laughed bitterly. "Livestock? You mean that death trap of a scrapyard with the bear?" "There's a codicil," Webb had continued. "The inheritance is contingent upon Ethan providing care for Kodiak, a 12-year-old Alaskan brown bear currently residing on the property. Failure to maintain this responsibility will result in forfeiture of the entire estate." The room had fallen silent. Isabel's perfectly composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that looked almost like fear. "A bear?" Ethan had managed. "Dad left me a bear?" The previous caretaker was Buck Morrison, a Vietnam veteran who'd worked for your father for 30 years, Webb explained. Unfortunately, Mr. Morrison disappeared 6 months ago. The bear has been alone since then. As Ethan sat in his truck outside the lawyer's office afterward, staring at the keys to a life he'd never wanted, one question haunted him. What kind of man disappears and leaves an 800-pound grizzly behind? The 2-hour drive to Cascade Salvage took Ethan through increasingly desolate Oregon countryside, past abandoned farms and dying timber towns that seemed to mirror his own sense of decay. When he finally turned off the main highway onto a gravel road marked only by a weathered sign reading, "Private property, keep out," he wondered if this was his father's idea of a joke or a punishment. The scrapyard sprawled across 40 acres of what had once been prime farmland. Rusted hulks of military vehicles sat in neat rows like metallic tombstones. Decommissioned Humvees, stripped aircraft fuselages, and equipment Ethan couldn't identify. His father had always claimed it was a legitimate government surplus business, buying and selling used military equipment to collectors and museums. Now, seeing the scope of it, Ethan wondered what other secrets the old man had been keeping. At the property's center stood a modest 2-story house, its white paint peeling but structurally sound. Behind it loomed a massive aircraft hangar, its corrugated steel walls showing rust stains like old blood. Smaller outbuildings dotted the landscape, workshops, storage sheds, and what looked like a converted barn with reinforced walls and a heavy steel door. That had to be where the bear lived. Ethan parked his beat-up Ford pickup near the house and sat for a moment, hands trembling slightly. Not from withdrawal this time, he'd managed to stay sober for the 3-day drive, but from genuine fear. He was about to meet an 800-pound predator that had been abandoned for 6 months. What kind of condition would it be in? What kind of condition was he in to handle this? The front door of the house was unlocked, revealing sparse but clean living quarters. Someone had been maintaining the place. Bills were paid, utilities functioning, refrigerator stocked with basic supplies. On the kitchen table, he found a manila envelope with his name written in his father's precise military handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Kodiak is in the barn. He's been fed twice daily by Margaret O'Connor from the neighboring property. The bear is not aggressive but requires respect and consistency. Everything you need to know is in Buck's journal in the barn office. Take your time with him, son. He's been waiting for you." Waiting for him? What did that mean? Ethan walked across the yard toward the barn, noting the pristine condition of the grounds despite 6 months without a proper caretaker. Someone had definitely been looking after things. Margaret O'Connor, whoever she was, had clearly gone above and beyond. The barn's exterior looked normal enough, but the steel reinforcements and industrial-grade locks suggested this was no ordinary livestock facility. He used the key from his father's envelope to open the heavy door and stepped into what could only be described as a luxury habitat. The interior had been converted into something resembling a high-end zoo enclosure. The concrete floor was covered with thick rubber mats and scattered with logs and boulders for climbing. A small stream ran along one wall, feeding into a pool large enough for swimming. The ceiling soared 20 feet overhead, with skylights providing natural illumination. Along the back wall was a smaller room, Buck's office presumably, with large windows overlooking the main enclosure. And in the center of it all, lying on his side in a patch of afternoon sunlight, was the largest bear Ethan had ever seen. Kodiak wasn't moving. For a terrifying moment, Ethan thought the animal might be dead. Then he saw the gentle rise and fall of the massive chest and realized the bear was simply sleeping. Even unconscious, the creature was magnificent. Dense brown fur with silver tips, massive shoulders that spoke of incredible power, and paws the size of dinner plates. Ethan found himself holding his breath as he approached the office. The door was unlocked, revealing a surprisingly sophisticated setup. Multiple monitors showed feeds from cameras positioned throughout the enclosure and around the property. Filing cabinets lined the walls, and a large desk held logbooks, veterinary records, and what appeared to be training manuals. Buck's journal sat open on the desk, the final entry dated 6 months ago. Day 4, 745 with Kodiak. The colonel is getting sicker. He's asked me to prepare contingency plans. If something happens to both of us, Ethan will inherit everything. The bear remembers him from childhood visits, though Ethan probably doesn't remember. Kodiak has been asking about him lately, keeps looking toward the road when vehicles pass. Animals know things we don't. Maybe it's time. Asking about him? Ethan frowned. Bears didn't ask about people. Buck had clearly been alone too long, anthropomorphizing his charge. A soft thud from the main enclosure made him look up. Through the office window, he saw Kodiak sitting upright, staring directly at him with dark, intelligent eyes. The bear tilted his massive head to one side, as if studying this newcomer, then rose to his feet with surprising grace. Ethan's mouth went dry. 800 pounds of apex predator was now moving toward the office with deliberate, measured steps. Kodiak approached the office window with a deliberate calm that somehow made Ethan more nervous than if the bear had charged. Those dark eyes never left his face, and there was an unsettling intelligence in that gaze, not the simple awareness of a wild animal, but something deeper, more calculating. The bear stopped directly in front of the window and sat back on his haunches, bringing his massive head level with Ethan's. For a long moment, man and bear simply stared at each other through the reinforced glass. Then Kodiak did something that made Ethan's blood run cold. He raised one massive paw and gently tapped the window 3 times, paused, then tapped twice more. It was deliberate, intentional, almost like a code. Ethan fumbled through Buck's journal, looking for any reference to the bear's behavior patterns. What he found made his hands shake. Entry after entry detailed Kodiak's unusual intelligence. The bear could operate simple mechanisms, understood complex verbal commands, and had demonstrated problem-solving abilities that bordered on the supernatural. Buck had documented instances where Kodiak seemed to predict events before they happened. Storms, vehicle arrivals, even phone calls. Day 3892. Kodiak led me to the old aircraft hangar today. Started digging behind the building like his life depended on it. Found Colonel's emergency cache buried 6 feet down. How did he know? Sometimes I think this bear knows more about what's happening here than I do. Ethan looked up from the journal. Kodiak was still watching him, head tilted expectantly. The bear's behavior was unlike anything he'd seen in nature documentaries or military training. This wasn't how wild animals acted around strangers, even ones they'd been raised with. A knock at the barn door made them both turn. Through the window, Ethan saw a small, elderly woman with silver hair and wearing a practical denim jacket. She waved at Kodiak, who immediately stood and moved toward the door with obvious excitement. "That'll be Margaret," Ethan muttered, remembering the note about his neighbor. He made his way out of the office, giving Kodiak a wide berth, and opened the barn door. Margaret O'Connor looked exactly like every grandmother Ethan had ever imagined, barely 5 feet tall, sharp blue eyes and hands that spoke of decades of hard work. She carried a large bucket that smelled of fish and meat. "You must be Ethan," she said with a warm smile. "I'm Margaret. I've been looking after this big fellow while you found your way here." She gestured to Kodiak, who had approached and was now sitting patiently beside her like an enormous, well-trained dog. "Ma'am, I appreciate what you've done, but you shouldn't be in here alone with Kodiak?" Margaret laughed, reaching up to scratch behind the bear's ears. The massive animal closed his eyes in obvious pleasure. "Honey, this bear has better manners than most people I know. Buck trained him well, and your father made sure he stayed that way." She moved to a feeding station near the pool and began distributing the contents of her bucket: fresh salmon, chunks of beef, and what looked like specially prepared nutritional supplements. Kodiak waited until she stepped back before approaching his meal, eating with surprising delicacy for such a massive creature. "Mrs. O'Connor, can I ask you something?" Ethan said. "Buck Morrison. What happened to him?" "The lawyer said he disappeared." Margaret's expression darkened. "Buck didn't disappear, son. He was murdered." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. "Murdered? By who?" "Can't prove it, but Buck was asking too many questions about your father's business partners, particularly those siblings of yours." Margaret's voice carried a bitterness that surprised him. "Buck found things, documents, records, things that made him nervous enough to start hiding evidence." "What kind of evidence?" "The kind that gets good men killed." Margaret watched Kodiak finish his meal and move to the pool for a drink. "Your father wasn't just running a scrapyard, Ethan. This place was a front for something bigger. Buck figured it out, and someone made sure he couldn't talk about it." Ethan felt the familiar anxiety crawling up his spine, the same feeling he'd had in Afghanistan when everything seemed normal, but something was fundamentally wrong. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Buck trusted you, said you were the only crossboy with honor left in him, and because Kodiak has been waiting for you." "Waiting for me, Mrs. O'Connor? I don't understand." "That bear knows things, son. Things that would make your head spin. Buck spent 10 years training him, and your father spent even longer teaching him secrets that died with both men." Margaret fixed him with those sharp blue eyes. "Kodiak has been protecting something in that hangar behind the barn. Buck died trying to tell someone about it." As if summoned by her words, Kodiak finished drinking and moved toward the barn door, looking back at Ethan expectantly. The message was clear. "Follow me." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Smart bear. He knows it's time." "Time for what?" "To show you what Buck died for, what your father spent 30 years hiding, and why your siblings are going to come for you next." She paused at the barn door. "That aircraft hangar isn't what it seems, Ethan. Nothing on this property is what it seems. But that bear will show you the truth, if you're brave enough to follow him." Kodiak was already walking toward the hangar with purposeful strides, occasionally looking back to ensure Ethan was following. Margaret squeezed his shoulder gently. "Trust him, son. He's been waiting a long time to share your father's secrets." Kodiak led Ethan across the scrapyard with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. The bear moved between the rows of military surplus with practiced ease, occasionally pausing to ensure Ethan was keeping up. When they reached the aircraft hangar, Kodiak stopped at what appeared to be a solid concrete wall at the building's rear and began pawing at a specific section. The wall looked identical to the rest of the foundation, but when Ethan knelt to examine the area Kodiak was indicating, he found hairline cracks forming a rectangle about 3 feet square. The bear sat back and watched as Ethan traced the outline with his fingers, feeling for any kind of mechanism or handle. "I don't see how this opens," Ethan muttered, but Kodiak simply huffed and moved to a rusted aircraft engine sitting nearby. The bear reared up on his hind legs and pushed against the engine with surprising precision, rotating it exactly 90 degrees clockwise. A soft, mechanical click echoed from within the concrete wall, and the rectangle of concrete swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a dark passage that sloped downward into the earth. Emergency lighting flickered on automatically, illuminating a tunnel that had clearly been professionally constructed. Ethan stared in amazement. "How did you know about this?" Kodiak was already moving into the tunnel, his massive form filling the space but moving with careful deliberation. The passage was large enough to accommodate the bear comfortably, which suggested it had been designed with him in mind. They descended for what felt like 50 feet before emerging into a vast underground chamber that took Ethan's breath away. The bunker was enormous, easily the size of an airplane hangar itself. Banks of computers lined the walls, their screens dark but power lights indicating they were in standby mode. Maps covered every available surface, marked with pins and annotations in his father's handwriting. File cabinets stretched from floor to ceiling along one wall, and a massive safe dominated the center of the room. But what caught Ethan's attention were the photographs. Hundreds of them, arranged on bulletin boards with connecting strings like a detective's conspiracy wall. Many featured his siblings, Caleb and Isabel, meeting with men Ethan didn't recognize in locations around the world. Other photos showed shipping containers, warehouses, and what appeared to be military equipment being loaded onto civilian transport. Kodiak moved to a desk where several manila folders lay open, weighted down by a paperweight shaped like a small bear, clearly a gift from the animal to his human partners. The bear gently nudged the top folder with his nose, then sat back expectantly. Ethan opened the folder and felt his world tilt on its axis. The documents inside detailed a massive international arms trafficking operation. Financial records showed millions of dollars moving through shell companies owned by Caleb's tech empire and Isabel's art galleries. Shipping manifests listed military-grade weapons being sold to private militias and terrorist organizations across 3 continents. But the most devastating revelation was a photograph paper-clipped to the front of the file. It showed Caleb shaking hands with a man Ethan recognized from classified military briefings. Ahmad Hassan, the arms dealer whose weapons had been found at the site where Ryan Mitchell's convoy was ambushed. Ethan's hands began to shake as he read his father's handwritten notes. Confirmed. Weapons shipment delivered to Hassan Network 3 weeks before Kandahar attack. Serial numbers match ordnance recovered from blast site. My own children financed the death of their brother's best friend. The room seemed to spin around him. Ryan had died because Ethan's siblings were selling weapons to the highest bidder, regardless of who got hurt. The guilt and grief he'd carried for 3 years suddenly transformed into something darker and more focused, a rage that burned cold and clean in his chest. Kodiak sensed his distress and moved closer, pressing his massive head against Ethan's shoulder in a gesture of comfort that seemed impossibly human in its understanding. The bear's presence anchored him, preventing him from spiraling into the familiar darkness of self-destruction. "They killed him," Ethan whispered. "They killed Ryan." More folders revealed the scope of his father's investigation. Colonel Samuel Cross had spent the last 5 years of his life building a case against his own children, documenting their crimes with military precision. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, witness statements, surveillance photos, and recorded conversations that would put both Caleb and Isabel in federal prison for life. But the final folder contained the most chilling revelation of all. A handwritten letter from Buck Morrison, dated just days before his disappearance. "Colonel, I think they know." Caleb called asking questions about the property, specifically about whether anyone had access to the hangar. I denied everything, but Isabel showed up at my place asking about Kodiak's special training. "I'm moving the most sensitive files to the secondary location. If something happens to me, make sure Ethan knows that bear is more than just a guardian. He's a witness. Kodiak saw everything." Ethan looked at the bear, who was watching him intently. "You saw Buck get killed, didn't you?" Kodiak's response was immediate and heartbreaking. The massive animal lowered his head and released a sound Ethan had never heard from a bear, a keening wail that spoke of loss and trauma and memories that wouldn't fade. It was the same sound he'd made the night Ethan almost pulled the trigger. The bear moved to another section of the bunker and stopped in front of a large monitor. When Ethan followed, Kodiak reared up and pressed a specific sequence of buttons on a control panel with his paws. The screen flickered to life, showing a menu of video files organized by date. Ethan selected a file from 6 months ago, the day Buck disappeared. The screen filled with security camera footage from multiple angles around the property. At first, everything appeared normal. Buck was going about his daily routine, feeding Kodiak, maintaining equipment, working at his desk in the barn office. Then, 3 vehicles arrived, expensive SUVs with tinted windows. 6 men in tactical gear emerged, along with 2 familiar figures that made Ethan's blood boil. Caleb and Isabel had come personally for this operation. The footage showed Buck trying to run when he saw them. He made it as far as the hangar before they caught him. What followed was a professional interrogation that quickly turned violent when Buck refused to reveal the location of his father's files. Kodiak had witnessed it all from his enclosure, unable to help his friend and trainer. The bear's anguish was visible even through the security camera, pacing, clawing at the reinforced barriers, releasing those heartbroken vocalizations as he watched Buck die. The final moments showed the mercenaries searching the property while Caleb and Isabel supervised. They found nothing because they were looking in the wrong places. Buck had hidden the most damaging evidence in the underground bunker, accessible only through a mechanism that required Kodiak's participation. Ethan closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd discovered. His siblings weren't just criminals, they were monsters who had murdered a good man to protect their empire built on death and suffering. And now they would come for him. "How long before they figure out I'm here?" he asked Kodiak, not really expecting an answer. The bear padded over to a communications console and activated a radio scanner with practiced ease. Voices crackled through static, professional, clipped conversations that made Ethan's military training kick into high alert. Target confirmed at the property. 2 individuals, male subject and the animal. Orders remain unchanged. Eliminate all witnesses. Recover any remaining evidence. Ethan's blood ran cold. They were coming tonight. Kodiak seemed to understand the urgency. The bear moved to a wall-mounted weapons cabinet and used his claws to manipulate the combination lock, a sequence Buck had clearly taught him. Inside were military-grade firearms, tactical gear, and surveillance equipment that his father had stockpiled for exactly this scenario. As Ethan began checking weapons and preparing defensive positions, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. The display showed Caleb's name, and after a moment's hesitation, Ethan answered. "Hello, little brother." Caleb's voice was smooth and confident, carrying the same condescending tone he'd used at their father's funeral. "I trust you're settling in well at your new home." "What do you want, Caleb?" "Direct as always. I appreciate that quality in you, Ethan. It's one of the few traits we share." A pause. "I want to make you an offer. A generous one. I'm prepared to purchase the Scrapyard from you for $10 million. Cash, no questions asked." "It's not for sale." Caleb's laugh was cold and humorless. "Everything is for sale, brother. The question is whether you're going to be reasonable about the price or whether we need to negotiate through other means." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm trying to save your life." The false warmth vanished from Caleb's voice, replaced by something sharp and dangerous. "You're in over your head, Ethan. That property contains things you don't understand, and your curiosity could get you killed, just like it got Buck Morrison killed." There it was, the confession Ethan needed. He was recording the call through the bunker's communication system, adding one more piece of evidence to his father's collection. "You murdered Buck." Buck was collateral damage in a much larger operation. He couldn't see the bigger picture, the global stability that our work provides. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good. Caleb's voice carried the tone of a man who had rationalized away his conscience years ago. "Your work?" "You mean selling weapons to terrorists?" "I mean providing balance in an unbalanced world. Every conflict needs arms dealers, Ethan. If we don't supply them, someone else will, someone with far fewer scruples than we have. You sold weapons to the people who killed Ryan. The silence that followed was answer enough. When Caleb finally spoke again, his voice was ice cold. Ryan Mitchell was a casualty of war. Wars that you helped fight, in case you've forgotten. Don't pretend you have clean hands in this. I never sold weapons to the enemy. No, you just pulled triggers for the military-industrial complex. At least Isabel and I built something meaningful with our actions. We created wealth, stability, influence. What did you create, brother? Nothing but debt and regret and empty bottles. The psychological warfare was expertly deployed, hitting every weakness and insecurity Ethan carried. But Kodiak's presence beside him provided an anchor, a reminder that he wasn't facing this alone. Here's what's going to happen, Caleb continued. You're going to take my offer and disappear. Leave the country, start over somewhere far away. Or you're going to suffer Buck's fate, and that bear of yours is going to be put down as a dangerous animal. Your choice. Go to hell, Caleb. I'll take that as a rejection of my generous offer. The line went dead. Kodiak was already moving toward the tunnel exit, his body language indicating extreme urgency. As they climbed back to the surface, Ethan could see headlights approaching in the distance, multiple vehicles converging on the property under cover of darkness. The final battle for his father's legacy was about to begin. The assault began at 2:47 a.m. with the systematic precision of a military operation. Ethan watched through night vision binoculars from the second floor of the main house as 12 figures in tactical gear spread across his property like spiders, their movements coordinated through silent hand signals and radio communications. Kodiak had positioned himself in the barn, where Buck's surveillance system gave him multiple camera angles of the approaching threat. The bear's training was evident in how he moved, staying low, avoiding sight lines, communicating with Ethan through a series of low vocalizations they'd practiced during their hasty preparation. The first wave came from the east, 4 men advancing toward the house while 2 more flanked around the aircraft hangar. Ethan had spent the previous hours setting defensive positions throughout the property, using his father's stockpiled equipment and his own military training to create overlapping fields of fire and multiple fallback positions, but what he hadn't anticipated was how personal this would become. "Ethan Cross, this is your final warning." Caleb's voice echoed across the scrapyard through a portable loudspeaker. "Surrender yourself and the animal, and this ends cleanly. Continue to resist, and we'll make this painful for both of you." From his position in the house, Ethan could see his brother standing behind an armored SUV at the property's perimeter, directing the operation like the CEO he was, delegating violence while keeping his own hands technically clean. Isabel stood beside him, her elegant silhouette incongruous with the tactical gear she wore. The first contact came when a mercenary tried to breach the barn where Kodiak was hidden. The bear's response was swift and devastating, 800 pounds of muscle and fury erupting from concealment to send the intruder flying 20 feet across the yard. The man's screams echoed through the night before cutting off abruptly. "Jesus Christ, what was that?" Ethan heard through his intercepted radio communications. "The bear. Command didn't mention it was that size." "Command didn't mention a lot of things," another voice replied grimly. Ethan used the distraction to move to his second position in the workshop behind the house. From there, he had clear sight lines to the hangar and could provide covering fire for Kodiak if needed. The bear had vanished back into the shadows, but Ethan could track his movements through the thermal scope his father had left with the weapons cache. The assault team regrouped and changed tactics, focusing on the house where they believed Ethan was barricaded. Flashbang grenades shattered the first-floor windows, followed by a coordinated breach from 3 directions. Ethan listened to their confused shouts as they swept through empty rooms, searching for a target who was no longer there. "He's not here!" Check upstairs. Check the basement. He's got to be somewhere. What about the barn? Stevens is down. That bear got him. We need heavier firepower. That's when Isabel took direct control of the operation, her voice cutting through the tactical chatter with cold authority. Forget the house. Burn it down. Force him out into the open. Ma'am, there might be civilians. There are no civilians here. Isabel's voice carried the same ruthless calculation that had built her art empire on blood money. Just targets and obstacles. Eliminate both. Ethan watched in horror as two mercenaries approached the house with military-grade incendiary devices. These weren't just criminals. They were professional soldiers, the kind of men who asked no questions as long as the pay was sufficient. The house where he'd hoped to find some connection with his father erupted in flames that painted the Oregon night sky orange and red. Smoke billowed across the scrapyard, providing cover but also limiting visibility for both sides. Ethan had to move again, using the chaos to reach his third fallback position near the aircraft hangar. That's when he saw Margaret O'Connor. The elderly woman was crouched behind an overturned military jeep, clutching an ancient deer rifle and looking simultaneously terrified and determined. She'd obviously heard the gunfire and come to help, despite being outnumbered and outgunned by professional killers. "Mrs. O'Connor, what are you doing here?" Ethan hissed as he reached her position. "This is my neighborhood, son. We look out for each other here." Her voice shook slightly, but her grip on the rifle was steady. Besides, that bear saved my grandson from a rattlesnake last summer. I owe him." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Ethan had two primary objectives: protect Margaret and protect Kodiak, while facing an enemy force with superior numbers and equipment. His only advantages were knowledge of the terrain and the element of surprise that Kodiak represented. That's when the bear made his move. Kodiak emerged from the burning barn like a force of nature, his massive form silhouetted against the flames. But instead of charging randomly, he moved with strategic precision, using the smoke and shadows to approach the command vehicle where Caleb and Isabel were coordinating the assault. Ethan watched through his scope as 800 pounds of fury erupted into the mercenaries' rear area. Men scattered in panic as Kodiak bowled through their formation, not killing but systematically dismantling their ability to fight. He destroyed communication equipment, scattered weapons, and created chaos that turned their coordinated assault into confused retreat. "Fall back! Fall back to the perimeter!" Caleb's voice had lost its smooth confidence, replaced by something approaching panic. But Isabel was made of harder stuff. Ethan saw her draw a sidearm and take aim at Kodiak's massive form. The bear was focused on destroying a radio array and didn't see the threat. Margaret's rifle cracked once, and Isabel stumbled, clutching her shoulder. The elderly woman worked the bolt action and chambered another round with practiced ease. "In my day, we didn't shoot animals unless they were dangerous," Margaret called out across the scrapyard. "But shooting good people? That makes you the dangerous animal." The tactical situation had reversed. Instead of being trapped and overwhelmed, Ethan and his unlikely allies had broken the mercenaries' coordination and forced them into defensive positions. But he knew this was temporary. Caleb would regroup and call in reinforcements. That's when he heard the helicopters. Two military-style aircraft appeared over the horizon, their spotlights cutting through the smoke and darkness. For a moment, Ethan thought his siblings had escalated to aerial assault. Then he heard the voice over the aircraft's loudspeaker. "This is FBI Special Agent Sarah Williams. You are surrounded. Lay down your weapons and surrender immediately." The cavalry had arrived, but how had they known to come? Ethan got his answer when he saw Kodiak sitting calmly beside the aircraft hangar, next to what appeared to be a satellite communication array that hadn't been there before. The bear had somehow activated an emergency beacon that transmitted his father's evidence files directly to federal authorities. Caleb's voice cut through the chaos one final time, but now it carried the desperate edge of a man watching his empire collapse. "This isn't over, Ethan. You have no idea what forces you're dealing with. What you've started here will destroy more than just our family." "Good," Ethan replied into his tactical radio, knowing Caleb would hear him. "Some things deserve to be destroyed." The FBI SWAT teams moved with professional efficiency, surrounding and disarming the remaining mercenaries while Caleb and Isabel were taken into custody. Ethan watched his siblings being led away in handcuffs, Isabel maintaining her composure while Caleb raged about lawyers and political connections that would no longer save him. But even as the immediate threat ended, Ethan felt no satisfaction. The cost had been enormous. His father's house was destroyed, Buck Morrison was still dead, and Ryan Mitchell's death had been avenged but not undone. Justice felt hollow when measured against such loss. Kodiak approached through the settling smoke, moving slowly and favoring his left front paw. The bear had been grazed by gunfire during the battle, but his injuries appeared superficial. More importantly, the trauma and grief that had haunted him since Buck's murder seemed to have lifted. He had protected his territory and his new human partner, fulfilling the mission Buck and Colonel Cross had trained him for. Margaret O'Connor appeared at Ethan's side, her rifle slung over her shoulder like a seasoned veteran. "Well, that was exciting," she said with characteristic understatement. "Nothing like this ever happened when Bill was alive." Agent Williams approached, a tall woman in her 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Mr. Cross, we need to debrief you about your father's investigation and the evidence he compiled. But first, that bear saved a lot of lives tonight. Most animals would have fled from gunfire and explosions." Kodiak charged toward the danger to protect his family. Ethan looked at the massive animals sitting patiently beside him, waiting for whatever came next. Family, that's exactly what they had become, not through blood or legal documents, but through shared trauma, mutual protection, and something deeper than either could fully understand. The battle was over, but the real challenge was just beginning, learning how to live with victory when the cost had been so high. The victory felt hollow as dawn broke over the smoldering ruins of Cascade Salvage. FBI agents and crime scene technicians swarmed the property, documenting evidence and cataloging the weapons cache that had turned a simple scrapyard into a battlefield. Ethan sat on the tailgate of an ambulance watching paramedics tend to Kodiak's wounds while Agent Williams debriefed him about the night's events. "Your father's evidence files are comprehensive," Williams said, reviewing documents on her tablet. "Financial records, shipping manifests, recorded conversations, enough to dismantle the entire trafficking network. Caleb and Isabel won't see freedom for the rest of their lives." Ethan nodded absently, his attention focused on Kodiak. The bear was being remarkably patient with the medical attention, allowing the veterinarian to clean and bandage his wounds with the stoic tolerance of a soldier who'd seen combat before. But there was something different in the animal's demeanor, a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "The problem," Williams continued, "is what happens next. This property is now a federal crime scene. We'll need months to process everything, and frankly, it's not safe for civilian habitation anymore. The house is destroyed, the barn is structurally compromised from the fire, and we've found explosive devices that Caleb's mercenaries planted but didn't have time to detonate." "What about Kodiak?" Williams hesitated, consulting her tablet with the uncomfortable expression of someone delivering bad news. "That's complicated. Officially, he's an exotic animal living in an unlicensed facility. Fish and Wildlife will need to evaluate whether he can remain in private custody, especially given his size and potential danger to the community." Margaret O'Connor, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since the shooting stopped, suddenly found her voice. "Danger to the community? Agent Williams, that bear protected this community tonight. He saved lives while your people were still figuring out where to point their helicopters. Ma'am, I understand your attachment to the animal, but regulations exist for public safety." "Public safety?" Margaret's voice rose with indignation. "I've lived next to Kodiak for 12 years. He's never hurt anyone who didn't deserve it. But you want to lock him in a cage somewhere because some bureaucrat in Washington is afraid of liability lawsuits." Ethan felt a familiar weight settling on his chest. The same crushing sense of helplessness he'd experienced in Afghanistan when regulations and politics superseded common sense and human decency. After everything they'd been through, after Kodiak had proven his loyalty and intelligence beyond any doubt, the system was going to punish him for being extraordinary. The veterinarian finished bandaging Kodiak's wounds and approached their group. "Doctor." Patricia Henley was a woman in her 50s who had clearly dealt with exotic animals before, but her expression suggested she'd never encountered anything quite like Kodiak. "Physically, he's in remarkable condition for an animal his age and size," she reported. "The gunshot wounds are superficial, and his overall health is excellent. But I'm concerned about his psychological state. He's exhibiting signs of severe depression, lethargy, loss of appetite, withdrawal from social interaction. In my professional opinion, this animal is grieving." "Grieving what?" Williams asked. Dr. Henley gestured toward the burned wreckage of what had been Kodiak's home for over a decade. "His entire world has been destroyed. The routine he's known for years, the territory he protected, the humans he bonded with, it's all gone. Animals form attachments just as deeply as humans do, and when those bonds are severed traumatically, they can suffer psychological damage that's often irreversible." Ethan watched Kodiak lying motionless beside the ambulance, staring at the ruins of the barn where he'd lived with Buck Morrison. The bear's posture spoke of defeat and resignation, as if he understood that this battle's victory had cost him everything that mattered. "There might be options," Dr. Henley continued carefully. "There are wildlife sanctuaries that specialize in bears who can't be returned to the wild. Facilities with proper permits and expertise to handle animals with Kodiak's unique background. He could live out his remaining years in safety and comfort." "In a cage," Margaret said bitterly. "In a secure environment with professional care and social interaction with other bears," Dr. Henley corrected diplomatically. Ethan felt something snap inside his chest, a clean, sharp break that reminded him of the moment he'd decided to stop drinking. "No." Williams looked up from her tablet. "Mr. Cross?" "No." Ethan stood up, decision crystallizing with military clarity. "I won't let you cage him. Kodiak isn't just some animal that needs to be managed and contained. He's a veteran who served his country as faithfully as any soldier. He protected classified information, maintained operational security for 30 years, and risked his life to bring criminals to justice. If that doesn't earn him the right to choose his own fate, then our system is more broken than I thought. Mr. Cross, I understand your emotional attachment. This isn't about emotion. It's about honor." Ethan's voice carried the authority of someone who'd found his moral center for the first time in years. "My father spent decades serving this country in ways that will never be acknowledged publicly. Buck Morrison died protecting secrets that kept American soldiers safe. Kodiak has earned the same respect and consideration we give to any other veteran." Agent Williams sighed. "What are you proposing?" "Give me custody. Officially. Make Kodiak my responsibility, and I'll guarantee his care and the community's safety." Ethan looked at the bear, who had raised his massive head and was watching the conversation with obvious interest. "We've both lost everything. Maybe we can build something new together. The regulations can be waived for national security assets. Margaret interrupted. "I've seen it done before when my late husband worked for the Forest Service. Exceptional circumstances, exceptional measures." Williams consulted her tablet again, typing rapidly. There would have to be conditions: regular veterinary inspections, secured facility, liability insurance, ongoing federal oversight. Whatever it takes. And you'd need a permanent location. Somewhere appropriate for an animal of his size and needs. Ethan looked around at the 40 acres of his inheritance, scorched earth that had once been his father's secret kingdom. For the first time since arriving in Oregon, he could envision a future that didn't involve running away from his past. "We'll rebuild," he said simply. "Both of us." But even as he spoke the words, Ethan felt the hollowness of victory settling deeper into his bones. Justice had been served, the criminals were captured, and the trafficking network was dismantled. So why did everything still feel like loss? 3 months after the raid, Ethan sat in the temporary trailer that served as his home office, staring at architectural plans for the new facility, while Kodiak dozed in the afternoon sunshine outside. The bear had been listless since the night of the battle, eating just enough to survive, but showing none of the intelligence and engagement that had made him extraordinary. Dr. Henley had warned that some animals never recovered from severe trauma, and Ethan was beginning to fear they were losing him to a grief too deep for healing. The knock on his trailer door interrupted his brooding. Through the window, he saw a familiar figure that made his stomach clench with anxiety. Agent Williams, but she wasn't alone. A tall man in an expensive suit stood beside her, someone whose presence immediately set Ethan's combat instincts on high alert. "Mr. Cross," Williams said when he opened the door. "This is Deputy Director Marcus Webb from the Department of Defense. He'd like to speak with you about Kodiak." Webb had the bearing of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question, but his expression was carefully neutral. "Mr. Cross, I'll be direct. We've reviewed your father's files and Buck Morrison's training records. Kodiak represents a significant national security asset, arguably the most successful example of human-animal tactical cooperation in military history." "He's not an asset," Ethan replied firmly. "He's a living being who's been through enough." "Of course. But you must understand the techniques used to train him, the protocols developed here. This research could revolutionize military and law enforcement operations. We'd like to study him, learn from him. The facility we're proposing would be state-of-the-art, with every comfort and consideration for his well-being." Ethan felt rage building in his chest, the same cold fury he'd experienced when facing his siblings. "You want to turn him into a lab rat. We want to honor his service by ensuring his legacy benefits future operations. Think of how many lives could be saved if we could replicate what your father and Buck Morrison accomplished here. By caging him and running experiments until he dies?" Webb's professional composure slipped slightly. "Mr. Cross, you're not seeing the bigger picture. Kodiak is already dying. Dr. Henley's reports show significant deterioration in his physical and mental health. He's not eating properly, he barely responds to stimuli, and his activity levels have dropped to critical lows. If current trends continue, he'll be dead within 6 months." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He'd known Kodiak was struggling, but hearing it stated so clinically made the reality impossible to ignore. Through the window, he could see the bear lying motionless in the same spot he'd occupied for hours, staring at nothing with empty eyes. "Our facility has veterinary psychiatrists who specialize in trauma recovery for service animals," Webb continued. "We can provide medical care and psychological support that simply isn't available in civilian settings. We're not talking about exploitation. We're talking about salvation." Agent Williams spoke for the first time since the introductions. "Ethan, I've seen the government's proposal. It's generous, a lifetime care guarantee, unlimited medical support, and significant research funding that would allow you to establish a veteran rehabilitation center here on the property. Everything you've talked about building, they're offering to make it happen. Ethan looked back at Kodiak, remembering the bear's fierce intelligence, his protective instincts, and his capacity for what could only be called love. The animal who had saved his life was slowly dying of heartbreak, and the people offering to help had agendas that went far beyond Kodiak's well-being. "I need time to think about this." "Time is the one thing we don't have," Webb replied. "Every day we delay, Kodiak's condition deteriorates further. If you truly care about his welfare—" "Don't!" Ethan's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Don't you dare question my commitment to him." Webb raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I apologize. That was inappropriate. But, Mr. Cross, please consider what's best for everyone involved. Your father and Buck Morrison sacrificed years of their lives for this research. Don't let their work die with the bear." After they left, Ethan sat beside Kodiak in the fading afternoon light, running his hand through the bear's thick fur. The animal barely acknowledged his presence, a heartbreaking change from the engaged, interactive companion who had once demonstrated such remarkable intelligence. "I don't know what to do, buddy," Ethan whispered. "Everyone says they know what's best for you, but nobody's asking what you want." That's when Margaret O'Connor appeared, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the determined expression Ethan had learned to respect. She'd been a constant presence during the reconstruction, offering practical support and the kind of no-nonsense wisdom that came from decades of rural living. "Government folks been sniffing around?" she asked, settling onto a folding chair beside them. "Defense Department. They want to take Kodiak for research." Margaret snorted with disgust. "Course they do. Same thing they wanted to do with my husband's maps after he died. Take everything that made sense of a life and turn it into bureaucratic nonsense." She poured coffee into 2 cups and handed one to Ethan. "What did you tell them?" "That I needed time to think." "Good. Because I've been thinking too, and I've got some things to say." Margaret's voice carried the authority of someone who'd raised 6 children and buried a husband while maintaining a farm through economic disasters and natural catastrophes. "That bear isn't dying from medical problems. He's dying from loneliness." Ethan looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Kodiak spent 30 years with 2 men who understood him completely. Buck Morrison and your father didn't just train him. They communicated with him. They made him part of their family, their mission, their daily lives. When Buck died and your father got sick, Kodiak lost his purpose. And when you showed up, he thought he'd found it again. But he did find it again. We work together, "You work around him," Margaret interrupted gently. "You care for him, you protect him, you provide for his physical needs, but you don't really see him as an equal partner anymore. You see him as a victim who needs to be saved." The observation stung because it was true. Ever since the night of the raid, Ethan had been so focused on Kodiak's trauma and vulnerability that he'd stopped recognizing the bear's intelligence and agency. He'd been treating him like a damaged animal instead of a wounded warrior. "So, what do I do?" Margaret smiled, the first genuine expression of hope Ethan had seen from her in months. "You ask him what he wants. And then you listen to his answer." That night, as federal agents and contractors debated Kodiak's future in conference rooms hundreds of miles away, Ethan made a decision that would change everything. He was going to give the bear a choice. Not between captivity and captivity, but between surrender and service. The question was whether Kodiak still had enough fight left in him to choose the harder path. The next morning, Ethan approached Kodiak with a different mindset entirely. Instead of the gentle, protective demeanor he'd adopted since the raid, he carried himself with the purposeful bearing of a soldier addressing a fellow veteran. The bear raised his massive head as Ethan approached, and for the first time in months, There was a flicker of genuine interest in those dark eyes. "We need to talk, partner," Ethan said, settling cross-legged on the ground facing Kodiak. "And I mean really talk, the way Buck and my father did with you." He pulled out a manila folder containing the architectural plans for the new facility. Not the sterile government research center Webb had proposed, but something entirely different. As he spread the blueprints on the ground between them, Kodiak shifted closer, his attention focusing on the documents with the sharp intelligence that had been dormant for months. "This is what I'm proposing," Ethan said, pointing to various sections of the plans. "The Kodiak Center for Veterans and Wildlife, not a research facility, not a prison, but a working partnership between wounded warriors, human and animal alike." The blueprints showed a revolutionary concept, a therapeutic ranch where military veterans suffering from PTSD would work alongside rescued and rehabilitated wildlife. The facility would house not just bears, but wolves, eagles, and other apex predators that had been injured or orphaned, animals that shared the same qualities of strength, intelligence, and dignity that made them ideal partners for healing damaged souls. "You wouldn't be a test subject," Ethan explained, watching Kodiak's reactions carefully. "You'd be the program director, the alpha. Every veteran who comes here would learn from you, not just about handling wildlife, but about courage, loyalty, and what it means to serve something bigger than yourself." Kodiak's response was immediate and dramatic. The bear rose to his full height, suddenly animated in ways Ethan hadn't seen since before the raid. He moved to the blueprints and, with surprising delicacy, used his claws to point to specific sections: the medical facility, the training areas, the living quarters for both humans and animals. "You understand what I'm proposing," Ethan said with growing excitement. "This isn't about hiding from the world or being protected by bureaucrats. This is about getting back to work." The bear's behavior transformed completely. The lethargy and depression that had characterized the past 3 months vanished, replaced by the focused energy of an animal with a mission. Kodiak moved through the construction site with renewed purpose, inspecting progress, checking security measures, and demonstrating the territorial awareness that had made him such an effective guardian. But the real test came 3 days later, when Margaret brought unexpected visitors. "Ethan, there are some folks here to see you," she called from the main gate. "Veterans from the Portland VA Hospital. Word's been getting around about what you're planning." The group that emerged from Margaret's van represented a cross-section of American military service spanning 3 generations. There was Thomas Chen, a young Marine who'd lost his left arm to an IED in Syria. Maria Santos, an Air Force veteran whose helicopter crash had left her with chronic pain and severe PTSD, and Robert Bear Johnson, a Vietnam veteran in his 70s who'd been fighting addiction and depression for decades. "We heard about what happened here," Thomas said, his voice carrying the careful control of someone managing invisible wounds. "About the bear who helped take down an arms trafficking ring. We wanted to see if the stories were true." Ethan looked at Kodiak, who had positioned himself between the visitors and the construction site, not aggressively but with the alert posture of a professional evaluating potential threats and opportunities. The bear's intelligence was fully engaged now, processing these new humans with the same tactical awareness he'd once applied to Buck Morrison's security protocols. "They're true," Ethan replied. "But Kodiak isn't a story or a legend. He's a working partner who's been through the same kind of trauma you have." Maria stepped forward, her prosthetic leg making soft mechanical sounds with each step. "The doctors at the VA say animal therapy can help with PTSD, but they're talking about dogs and horses. Nothing like this." "Nothing like this has ever been tried before," Ethan admitted. "The theory is that apex predators, animals that have faced life-and-death situations and survived, can understand combat trauma in ways that domestic animals can't. But it's just theory until we test it." Robert, the Vietnam veteran, had been studying Kodiak with the calculating gaze of someone who'd seen every kind of military animal training. "That bear's sizing us up. He's not just looking, he's evaluating, making decisions about threat levels and compatibility." As if responding to the observation, Kodiak approached the group with deliberate steps. He stopped in front of Maria first, lowering his massive head to sniff carefully at her prosthetic. Then he did something that made everyone freeze. He gently touched the artificial limb with his paw, as if acknowledging a shared experience of physical trauma and adaptation. "Jesus," Thomas whispered. "He knows." Kodiak moved to each veteran in turn, spending time with Robert to examine scars on the older man's arms, and sitting quietly beside Thomas as the young Marine worked through what was obviously a panic attack triggered by unexpected memories. Throughout it all, the bear demonstrated an intuitive understanding of human psychology that went far beyond simple animal intelligence. This is what Buck Morrison trained him for, Ethan realized aloud. Not just security and combat support, but emotional intelligence, the ability to recognize and respond to human trauma. Dr. Patricia Henley arrived that afternoon for Kodiak's weekly health evaluation, but what she found defied every clinical expectation. The bear, who had been listless and depressed for months, was now fully engaged, demonstrating complex social behaviors and problem-solving abilities that belonged in veterinary textbooks. "His neurological responses are completely different," she told Ethan privately. "Heart rate stable, stress hormones normalized, social engagement off the charts. Whatever you did, it worked. I gave him his job back." The real transformation became evident over the following weeks as construction on the facility accelerated. Kodiak took an active role in every aspect of the project, from inspecting building materials to supervising the installation of specialized enclosures for other animals. He had become the alpha of an operation that didn't yet exist, but his confidence and engagement inspired everyone around him. The breakthrough moment came when the first rescue animal arrived, a young wolf named Sierra, who had been orphaned by poachers and raised in captivity. She was aggressive, fearful, and had never learned proper social behaviors from her own kind. Every attempt to rehabilitate her had failed, and wildlife officials were preparing to euthanize her as unadoptable. Kodiak's interaction with Sierra was a masterclass in interspecies communication. Within hours, he had established himself as the pack leader, using body language and vocalizations to calm her anxiety and teach her appropriate boundaries. By the end of the week, Sierra was following Kodiak around the property like a devoted student, learning not just survival skills, but the kind of emotional regulation that would allow her to eventually work with traumatized veterans. "It's unprecedented," Dr. Henley reported to Agent Williams during her weekly briefing. "We're seeing therapeutic breakthroughs that typically take months of traditional treatment happening in days." Kodiak isn't just recovering. He's becoming something entirely new. Deputy Director Webb made one final attempt to acquire Kodiak for government research, but his proposal was met with unified resistance from an unexpected coalition. The veterans who had found healing at the center, the wildlife officials who had seen miraculous rehabilitations, and Margaret O'Connor, who testified before a congressional committee about the program's impact on rural communities. The decision was unanimous. Kodiak would remain where he belonged, not as a research subject or a curiosity, but as the heart of something revolutionary, a bridge between species, a healer of wounds that traditional medicine couldn't touch, and proof that sometimes the most extraordinary partnerships emerge from the deepest tragedies. 6 months later, Ethan stood on the wraparound porch of the new main lodge at the Kodiak Center for Veterans and Wildlife, watching the morning routine that had become the heartbeat of their revolutionary program. The Oregon sunrise painted the Cascade Mountains in shades of gold and amber, while across the 40-acre facility, A transformation was taking place that exceeded his wildest hopes. In the main courtyard, Kodiak was conducting what could only be described as morning assembly. The massive grizzly sat at the center of a loose circle that included 12 military veterans, 6 rescue animals, and a handful of staff members who had traveled from across the country to be part of this unprecedented experiment in healing. Thomas Chen, the young Marine who had lost his arm in Syria, was working with Sierra, the wolf Kodiak had rehabilitated months earlier. What had started as simple animal care had evolved into something profound. Thomas had discovered that his missing limb didn't define his capability when he was focused on Sierra's needs. The wolf, in turn, had learned to trust again by watching Thomas overcome his own fears and limitations. Maria Santos sat quietly beside Thunder, a golden eagle who had been found with a shattered wing and severe trauma from illegal captivity. Both had learned to navigate the world with physical disabilities. But more importantly, they had discovered that survival wasn't just about individual strength, it was about accepting help and offering support in return. Maria's panic attacks, which had plagued her for 3 years after her helicopter crash, had virtually disappeared since she began working with Thunder. But it was Robert Bear Johnson who represented the program's most remarkable success. At 73, the Vietnam veteran had spent decades battling addiction and depression that stemmed from losing his entire squad in a jungle ambush. Traditional therapy had failed him repeatedly, but his partnership with Kodiak had unlocked something that 50 years of treatment couldn't touch. "You know what changed everything?" Bear had told Ethan recently. "It wasn't the bear's size or strength. It was seeing another warrior who'd lost everything and found a way to keep serving. Kodiak showed me that surviving isn't enough. You have to find new battles worth fighting." The center now housed 24 veterans in various stages of recovery, paired with an equal number of rescued animals. The partnerships weren't random. Each pairing was carefully orchestrated based on compatible trauma patterns, personality assessments, and the mysterious chemistry that sometimes emerged between damaged souls seeking healing. Dr. Patricia Henley had become the program's chief veterinarian and psychological consultant, developing protocols that were being studied by military hospitals worldwide. Her research had documented recovery rates that defied conventional medicine. PTSD symptoms reduced by 70%, addiction relapse rates down to single digits, and suicide risk factors virtually eliminated among program participants. "What we're seeing here challenges everything we thought we knew about trauma recovery," she had written in her preliminary report to the Department of Veterans Affairs. "The human-animal bond, when properly structured and supported, appears to access healing mechanisms that traditional therapeutic approaches cannot reach." But the real measure of success was visible in the daily interactions between veterans and their animal partners. Ethan watched as Sarah Mitchell, a Navy corpsman who had survived 3 IED attacks in Afghanistan, worked with Nova, a black bear cub who had been orphaned when poachers killed her mother. Both had experienced loss that seemed insurmountable, but together they had found strength that neither possessed alone. The transformation in Kodiak himself was the program's greatest miracle. The bear who had been dying of grief 6 months earlier was now the undisputed leader of a community that spanned species boundaries. He had developed an uncanny ability to assess new arrivals, both human and animal, and determine optimal pairings that maximized healing potential. Margaret O'Connor, now officially the center's community liaison, had documented Kodiak's decision-making process with the fascination of an anthropologist studying a new civilization. "He's not just intelligent," she had reported to the board of directors. "He's wise." There's a difference between learning behaviors and understanding the deeper currents of emotion and need. Kodiak has become something unprecedented, an apex predator who leads through compassion rather than dominance. The success had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Major universities were requesting research partnerships, military hospitals were sending observers to study the protocols, and wildlife rehabilitation centers were adapting the center's methods for their own programs. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Ryan Mitchell's parents, David and Linda, had visited 3 months earlier to see the memorial garden that had been established in their son's honor. What they found was something far more significant than a monument. They found a living legacy that honored their son's sacrifice by healing the wounds of war. Ryan would have loved this, Linda had told Ethan through tears of joy rather than grief. He always said that the best way to honor the fallen was to take care of those who made it home. This place does that in ways we never imagined possible. The Ryan Mitchell Memorial Garden had become the center's spiritual heart, a place where veterans could commune with memories of fallen comrades while surrounded by the evidence that healing was possible. Kodiak had claimed the garden as his special domain, often found there in the early morning hours, as if maintaining a vigil for all the warriors who couldn't be saved. The financial model had proven surprisingly sustainable. Government contracts for veteran rehabilitation, private donations from military families, and revenue from training programs for other facilities had created a stable funding base. More importantly, many program graduates had chosen to remain as staff members, creating a self-perpetuating community of healing that grew stronger with each new arrival. Ethan's personal transformation had been as remarkable as any of the veterans in the program. The broken alcoholic who had nearly taken his own life 18 months earlier had become a confident leader, therapeutic innovator, and advocate for a new approach to trauma recovery. His relationship with Kodiak had evolved from guardian and protected to equal partners in a mission that transcended their individual healing. The center had also attracted the attention of Dr. Sarah Williams, a clinical psychologist specializing in military trauma, who had relocated from Boston to join the program. Her research on the neurological effects of interspecies bonding had provided the scientific framework that legitimized what everyone at the center experienced intuitively, that some forms of healing required partnerships that transcended traditional boundaries. Their professional collaboration had naturally evolved into something personal, and Ethan found himself experiencing emotions he had thought were permanently damaged by war and loss. Sarah's understanding of trauma, combined with her respect for the unconventional methods that had proven so effective, made her the perfect partner for someone whose healing journey had been anything but traditional. As the morning assembly concluded and veterans dispersed to their daily activities with their animal partners, Ethan felt a profound sense of completion. Not the ending of a story, but the beginning of something that would continue long after he was gone. Kodiak approached the porch with his characteristic dignity, climbing the steps with surprising grace for an animal his size. He settled beside Ethan's chair, looking out over the facility they had built together from the ashes of tragedy and loss. "We did it, buddy," Ethan said softly, running his hand through the bear's thick fur. "We found our mission." Kodiak's response was a low rumble of contentment, not the aggressive growl of a predator, but the satisfied sound of a being who had found his purpose. Together, they watched as their community of healing continued its daily work of proving that the bonds between species could transcend trauma, that service didn't end with discharge, and that sometimes the most profound victories emerged from the deepest defeats. In the distance, Thomas was teaching Sierra new commands, while Maria guided Thunder through flight exercises designed to rebuild confidence in his injured wing. Bear Johnson was mentoring a newly arrived Korean War veteran, sharing the hard-won wisdom of someone who had found hope in the darkest hours. The Kodiak Center for Veterans and Wildlife had become more than a rehabilitation facility. It was living proof that healing was always possible, that purpose could be rediscovered, and that the most powerful medicine was often the simple recognition that no one had to face their battles alone. Message for American seniors, 55 to 68. In an era when our veterans return home more wounded than ever and traditional support systems fail them, the story of Ethan and Kodiak reminds us that healing comes from purpose, not pity. Like many of you who've witnessed decades of societal change, these heroes discovered that the most profound solutions often emerge from the simplest truth. We heal when we serve something greater than ourselves. Whether it's mentoring a struggling neighbor, volunteering with local veterans, or simply offering the wisdom that comes with lived experience, your generation understands that true fulfillment comes from giving back. Just as Kodiak found new life by becoming a healer rather than remaining a victim, perhaps your greatest adventures still lie ahead, in the lives you can touch, the wisdom you can share, and the legacy you can build. What moment in your life transformed you from surviving to truly living? Have you ever experienced healing through helping others overcome their struggles?